speaker is Dr. Maswood Akhter, and his paper is on universal or culture specific, raising the issue of critical apartheid in the reception of postcolonial writing. Dr. Maswood Akhter is Professor of English at the University of Rajshahi, Bangladesh. He taught postcolonial literature and human rights in the Department of Humanities at Regis, Massachusetts, USA as Fulbright Scholar in Residence. He has published extensively on issues around postcolonial literatures and discourses in different well-reputed journals, and has supervised a good number of research theses in that area too. For his paper on Bengali diaspora writing published in South Asian Review, Dr. Akhter received University Grants Commission of Bangladesh Award in the category of Best Research Paper in Arts and Humanities. One of his recent publications includes a book chapter in Postcolonial Urban Outcasts, City Margins in South Asian Literature, published by Routledge in 2017. And the last speaker, the panel, is Abdullah Al Mamun, and the title is Past Posts and the Market, Revisiting the Postcolonial. Abdullah Al Mamun is a professor of English in the Department of English, Rajshahi University, Bangladesh, and at present is completing his tenure as a chairperson of the department, besides regular activities of teaching postgraduate and undergraduate students and supervising research at postgraduate, MPhil and PhD levels. His responsibilities as the chairperson include curriculum development, student counseling, and office management. He is also the coordinator of the translation and editing cell that gives translation and editorial services locally and internationally. Professor Mamun has special interest in translation studies, literary and cultural theory, critical pedagogy, and poetry, with special focus on romantic poetry. He has taken translation theory and practice seriously and is now engaged in doing translations from English into Bangla and vice versa. He has also been working for 7 years as an editor of the departmental peer-reviewed journal.
My paper is entangled with the issue of literary texts, and the issue has been raised in the context of the reception of South Asia, what may be termed as critical injustice or academic apartheid. So my title goes like this: universal or culture specific, the issue of critical injustice or academic apartheid in the reception of South Asian or postcolonial literature, or literary criticism, as well as in popular imagination. The classical status or canonicity of a Shakespearean play is established and perpetuated through its supposed ability, for example, for projecting emotions and situations can relate to. The customary reception of a postcolonial or South Asian text, academic experts nor general readers deem her qualified for universality or narrative that have been snuffed. South Asian or postcolonial writing is thus perceived as a literary phenomenon. Very crucially, such seemingly conscious undermining or systematic neglect of a postcolonial or South Asian writer's capacity or her text's possibility robs her of her primary identity or agency as creative writer and relegate her to the position of a mere ethnographer. By perceiving such authors as capable only of being spokesperson for her community, or her works as singularly representative of a specific culture, we limit the outcome of the author's efforts and undermine the value of what we gain from those. Paradoxically, however, such an approach, rather than exposing inadequacies of texts, betrays its own limitations, the limitations of the approach itself, especially its tragic failure to recognize essential overlaps and shared symbols across cultures. In fact, any engaged analysis of the thematic and stylistic choices in South Asian writings would go against such reductive definition and pigeonholing, showing how one can easily comprehend the universality of certain struggles and expectations in those texts, even when they carry unmistakable signatures of their respective cultures. There is a widespread tendency or interpretive behavior that see these works, especially the ones from diasporic authors, as part of armchair tourism or an exotic cultural commodity, and this not only amounts to undermining their literary worth, but even threatens their very identity as a literary category. Located originally in imagination. Dhaka once said that being pigeonholed as an ethnic writer and being expected to be spokesperson for the community, even when it is well-intentioned, can be startling. Her other colleagues too have categorically expressed their deep disappointments at such ghettoizing tendency that prevents them from effectively thriving as writers per se, and not as authentic experts ready with their native locals or cultural items in order to woo foreign audiences with exotica. Neil Mukherjee recalls his experience with one UK publisher. He approached the publisher for his debut novel, Postcolonial, who wanted him to turn the novel into fluffy, romantic, witty exotica fest by including more of India's heat and dust, smells and colors. Is it not unfair or flawed interpretive enterprise that looks at locations and affiliations of artists to measure their gifts? Such reading fails to appreciate that, like other great pieces born in Western cultures, South Asian stories are at the same time human stories. That while there are culture-specific elements in the language and narration, they have been able to transcend their immediate temporal reality, to connect to the larger human questions and general human affairs. That they are simultaneously immediate and eternal, local and universal, as they can, and that they can create beauty for beholders of all creeds and continents. While many postcolonial narratives are entangled only expectedly with colonial memories, the issues in them, like struggles for freedom, pitfalls of nationalism, intricacies of human relations, the eternal tragic tension between limitless human desires and limited human capacities, and so on, imply the overlap of context-specific and universal themes, and aid in the understanding of a literary objective outside of the context of colonialism. A more critically just, academically sound way to approach South Asian texts would be, therefore, understanding their ability and possibility to relate to a wider range of human experiences and expectations, instead of an obsessive investigation into their cultural authenticity. One of the first women writers of the Indian subcontinent to creatively engage in the language of English, Rokeya Sakhawat Hussein's short story, Sultana's Dream, for instance, envisions a ladyland where ladies manage the entire public affairs and men are kept in Mardana, a counterpoint to Janana. Janana is, of course, exclusive segregated space for women in a Bengali Muslim household. Janana and Mardana may be culturally specific, but challenging the naturalization of absurdity of male monopoly is global in its coverage. And because of its mix of familiar literary forms, parody, satire, science fiction, fantasy, allegory, and so on, it becomes easier for readers from any cultural background to connect to the common insight that this piece of Sakhawat Hussein offers regarding patriarchy. The text has color and character of the culture lived by its writer, but at the same time, it echoes voices of gender justice worldwide. There are obvious parallels. A critic thus compares Sultana's Dream to the Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman to illustrate how the protagonists of these two short stories, despite their cultural and economic difference, seek measures to obtain freedom from respective situations, again in their own way, but singular in their intentions. The narrator in Gilman's story is also confined to one room and of course confined socially, like Rokeya's Women in General. The line between cultural specificity and universality becomes less distinct, and the span of impact of the work becomes significantly wider. It should thus be a flawed academic undertaking to elect a postcoloniality universality binary because that betrays a tragic absence of important insights into human life and cultural evolution. Firstly, what I have already said, the essential overlap and interconnectedness between cultures and communities. Second, defining a text as mere culturally specific creation is to make a statement about its literary quality, underestimating its worth and capacity, potentials and possibilities. Rather than viewing the works in this parochial manner and limiting the outcome of these authors' efforts, it is imperative to consider the larger connections and wider impacts, and to comprehend the universality of certain struggles portrayed in those texts. In a lesser-known Bangladeshi writer in English, Ali Arifur Rahman's brilliant short story, Grandmother's Wardrobe, the protagonist's surprising discovery of gold coins in an ancestral furniture and his subsequent loss of memory that renders the just discovered fortune entirely futile, projects an ironic vision of life as Arkenar's novel financial expert or the guide, and many of his other works share a similar wisdom of life and reflects universal human predicament, although replete with culturally nuanced details of an imaginary town called Malgudi. It is easy for one to draw wider conclusions about the meaning of these works, rather than restricting them to a particular situation. In Achilles' Things Fall Apart, while it might be difficult to understand for readers of different backgrounds the more culturally nuanced actions that Okunku, the protagonist, takes, one can see how his inner conflicts and struggle encompass the universal struggle to retain self-respect and eventual failure to preserve it. Okunku meets the fact that he struggled to avoid all his life. Again, limiting the parent-child relationship in Jhumpa short story Unaccustomed Art to the expectations the protagonist Ruma faces as a daughter of Bengali immigrant parents, the reader would apprehend the commonality of such familiar relations and obligations. Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist, on the other hand, shows how interpersonal relationships between individuals and warring communities may restore hopes in a civilization wounded by 9/11. Reducing any of these works simply to culturally specific representation would essentially rob them of their ability for wider influence and their transhistoricity and thematic expanse, their larger implications and significance at any point of time or location. Now to enter into the other dimension of this academic appetite, Adib Khan once commented that he is tryst with multiple countries, communities and culture endowed him with a capacity whereby, I quote him, a Bangladeshi can fictionalize a white Australian's experience. His novel Homecoming, unlike his other fiction Seasonal Adjustments and Spiral Road, is thus set entirely in Australia, and is not about migrants, but about a Caucasian Vietnam veteran concerned with his moral lapse during the war. The book did not attract wide readership. For a more appropriate case in point, remember the fate of Monica Ali's post-Bricklayan affair with European and American settings. No doubt, Ali was included in Granta's 2003 decadal list of 20 best young British novelists. But then, please note that the Granta editor Ian Jack commended Bricklayan specifically for bringing news from Banglatown, an area in East London crowded historically by multiple ethnic minorities, one of the largest immigrant arrivals being from Bangladesh. Ali's status as an ethnic icon, an image so hyped by the Western media, automatically ghettoizes her and curbs her creative freedom of representation. Ali's later pieces are ignored, arguably not because of the lesser literary merit, but for the author's trading into not permissible grounds, meaning non-ethnic materials, for trying to appropriate the undue privilege of, quote, speaking to all humanity, unquote. Alentejo Blue, her second novel, is set in and around an apparently unspoiled rural region of Portugal called Alentejo, where Ali once spent her summer holidays, despite her almost apologetic alibi that she could not resist the theme which kept visiting her. She could not win her reviewers. Alentejo Blue in no way repeated the fairy tale run of the best-selling Bricklayan. According to Nielsen Bookscan statistics, whereas Bricklayan had climbed US bestseller list and sold more than 2 million copies, allegedly squeezed out a mere 6,000 insults. Because by reversing the anthropological gaze in Alantaju Blue, Ali violated the rules of the game. She does not own the license to make it her subject. A case of academic apartheid indeed. Quite understandably, therefore, finally sets her third novel in the multicultural kitchen of the London hotel. A well-intentioned reviewer commented that though Ali, quote, wrong-footed her readers, unquote, with Alantaju Blue, she now returned to pick up Brooklyn themes. More interestingly, her publisher Daffodil too describes In the Kitchen as a follow-up to Brooklyn. Ali has run into a problem faced also by others. She is assumed to have as the critic points out, home turf, from which editors and accountants are eager for her not to stray. In her fourth novel, Untold Story, Ali delineates a fictional princess whose life trajectory resembles Diana, the tragic princess of Wales. Apparently, this is Ali's tryst with the popular subgenre of thriller to respond to the test of the general reading public in the West. But alas, that too did not work. Ali thus is never allowed to come out of the shadow of Brooklyn. The spectre of her debut novel is eternally invoked, almost as the code of conduct for her to keep her within the rightful track of writing. Now, does a writer really need to qualify as insider or outsider to be eligible to write about the concerned reality? Helpfully, Rushdie opined in his imaginary homelands that literature is self-validating and not the business of copywriting certain theme for certain groups. Monica Lee also suggested in an interview for Daily Star, standing neither behind a closed door nor in the thick of things, but rather in the shadow of a doorway is a good place from which to observe. This is to say that you need not be an insider or outsider to write about something. No matter wherever you are currently located and whatever your subject positions are, you have the right to speak of any individual or community of your choice. Indeed, there can be many versions of the same place, people, or situation, and you derive meaning in one way or other from all of those. One cannot snatch from the writer her right to write and decide for her subject and setting. What one is entitled to do rather is to critique the writer's choice. Indeed, it is not a matter of creative handicap, even if a literary piece is deemed as authentic voice of a culture. It does not nullify her potentials for universality. The divide between culture specific and universal is rather artificial and even racist as far as literary creations are concerned, since portrayal of a specific set of peoples, places, and periods may simultaneously stand there as metaphor for wider spectrum of human situations. Moreover, one way to conceive universality is to imagine it as a composite of varied human experiences rather than an amorphous essence of the same. And many of the South Asian postcolonial or diasporic authors, with their hybridized writerly consciousness and positionality, are perhaps no less qualified to portray variegated human reality when compared to their Western colleagues. I end here today. Before I leave, I want to thank the head of English here at Daffodil, Rakib, and his team. And I want to say that it's an absolute privilege to be part of this conference. Thank you.
Thanking Rakib, the head of the department, and his colleagues, his team, his students, and the university as well, for arranging such a platform for this kind of discussion. Actually, I can stop here because nothing else is left for me. The way I prepared my presentation, subject-wise, it was done by Professor Maswood in the morning, and the anger that was there was given by Shafiul Azam. So both are taken from me. So the only thing that I can now do is dutiful to read out what I have written here. Some of them will be very repetitive, boring also to you, but I have to finish this as it is there.
There is no doubt that in a remarkably short time, post-colonial studies has become one of the most vibrant fields in contemporary intellectual life. Together with postmodernists and post-structuralists, post-colonial critics have fundamentally shifted current thinking about hegemony, culture, and knowledge structures, and established post-colonial thought as an important area of academic inquiry. But it is very interesting to observe the extremely nuanced and highly complicated, though at the same time suavely fine-tuned with the tunes of the centers, of course, at the same time superbly fine-tuned journey of post-colonial activism with the goal of decolonial praxis for interventionist possibilities through its tryst with new left postmodernist flirtations to the love relation with marketability that inheres complicity in covering up contemporary problems of social, political, and especially cultural linguistic domination. This itinerary of progress or degeneration, we might consider this as a progress, we might consider this as a degeneration, it's up to you, may be considered as a result of the compromise that the claim of potency is something that is powerfully challenging. The claim of potency is post-colonial praxis and post-colonial texts has made by premature celebration of the past ways of colonialism and by outlaying the valorization of the insignias like diaspora, multiculturalism, and decolonization, through which ironically they undermine their own positions. For they fail to see that neocolonialism is the condition of possibility of post-colonialism, which can be articulated as a neo-Gramscian counter-discourse in the age of hegemonic imperialism. This is a quotation actually from Shaw G, Rethinking the Problem of Post-Colonialism, recently published in a journal, Cultural Studies in China and the West. And when I was actually going through in the last few days, I found another article by Marcus Regan Leitner, Central European Culture in Search of a Theory, or the lure of post/colonial studies. He mentions some fundamental weaknesses with these post-colonial studies here. He makes a list actually here, and the list is like this: that post-colonial theories allege blind spots in regard to questions of class and gender, its privileging of literature over other forms of cultural production, its aestheticization of resistance, its reliance on literary canons, and its own hegemonic position within the academy. So these are the weaknesses this writer has mentioned, which go with my the way I am trying to address the problems of post-colonialism. Now, if we perceive this as a failure of post-colonialism, we can easily trace back and identify the fundamental flaws which were there at the very inception and throughout the growths, which were actually inseparable elements or properties of the whole project of post-colonialism. The way the second generation post-colonialists, say the empire rights back generation, attempted to problematize history of East-West dichotomy based on the foundation of concepts of nation and nationalism, and ironically at the same time plead to the center for a dialogue of resistance and negotiation, is more or less a rephrasing of older problems of third worldism in the language of post-structuralism. And because of this self-negating foundational positioning, they very quickly fell back on the well-known binaries of structuralism and modernist latitudes. This obsession with the old binaries and the resultant anxiety of being, and also being free from that being, a cultural or linguistic progeny or legacy of the empire, we deliberately avoided examining the relationship between colonialism and post-colonialism and global capitalism. And this avoidance has resulted into academic marketability into two diverse ways in countries like Bangladesh. Firstly, to use the statement made in the introduction of the Empire Writes Back, I am quoting from Empire Writes Back from the introduction, it caused those from the periphery to it caused those from the periphery to immerse themselves in and I think that also within this third bracket, that and also to shy away from the imported culture, denying their origins in an attempt to become, and I think also not to become, more English than the English. But instead of such writers as Henry James and T.S. Eliot, this is also they mentioned these two names in that introduction, Henry James and T.S. Eliot, we find here in our context of postcolonialism, God's plenty, and the endless spawning of writings in English. And in the meantime, we have lost tracks of differences of distinctions between postcolonial literature, diaspora literature, immigration literature, Anglophile literature, and tourism literature. Most importantly, and these are not my terms, I've taken these, different branches of literature from this book, that tourism and postcolonialism, contested discourse, identities and representations, by Michael Hall and Hazel Tucker, published in 2004 by Rutledge. Okay. Most importantly, we have developed this habit of the mind to equate postcolonial literature with English and put more or less all writings in all other languages from the so-called British colonies under eternal erasure. This is the first way. The second one is, secondly, to avoid the cultural domination that was mentioned in Empire Rights Back, to avoid the cultural domination to be ensured by the imposition of the study of English literature, we have got trapped in the propaganda of teaching or learning English without culture or cultural hegemony, and championed, knowingly or unknowingly, the business of selling English under so many different programs, in so many different packages. Being totally immersed in the process and completely bewildered, we become almost oblivious of the existence of so many other languages and accept English as the lost key of paradise for the global south or southern globe. This lost key of paradise may reopen the past of Father Reginald Heber, Sir William Jones, or even Thomas Babington Macaulay, and reconnect the World Bank slogan, and this is, I'm quoting from World Bank's website. The World Bank slogan, to end extreme poverty and promote shared prosperity in a sustainable way. To Jack's pronouncement in The Lord of the Flies. Jack is a character in Lord of the Flies. We have got to have rules and obey them. After all, we are not savages, we are English. And the English are best at everything. So we have got to do the right things. Though Jack is talking about English nation, we have transpositioned all these qualities of the nation to its language. Okay, and that I think I consider as the ultimate degeneration of our power. Now, this is more or less in a kind of summary of the criticism that I think that it's possible about the present state of postcolonialism. We can try to develop, the ways or approaches through which we can go beyond this. We have reached such a state of things, perhaps because of our incapacity to respond to the past in the proper post-colonial manner. And this incapacity necessitates the entire or misidentification of the community that counts. This is quotation from Agamben, community that counts. That means a proper assessment of the present. But because of the post-colonial, as well as postmodernist elitism and disjuncture between intellectuals and the masses, and the obsession of the representative post-colonial center with the celebration of the insignias, we fail to realize that the post-colonial, the community that comes, is not future. That means the community will not come, it is already there, but we ignore that community. The community that is not future, it is not going to come, but it is always coming. The whole post-colonial community is already always there. But their very mode of existence is conditioned by invisibility, is reduced to what Agamben calls pure lie, which is the product of the distinction between lie and politicized lie. This community may be brought back into existence only by giving them their identity and by exploring the political, social, and cultural structures of the present. To rephrase Agamben's densely metaphoric representation, we may take help of another set of metaphors. that Walter Benjamin uses to understand or interpret history, in which he looks at the past through here and now. That means to articulate the past historically doesn't mean to recognize it the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. And this is a quotation from Walter Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history. This presence of the receiver or the historian as an agency is of supreme importance in Benjamin because he or she will have the gift of fanning the spark of hope in the past, who is firmly convinced that even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins. And this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. And that has happened to our study of present-day postcolonialism as such. What Benjamin terms as a struggle against fascism may also be used to interpret against colonialism or neo-colonialism. I am quoting from Benjamin, "The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule." That means the state of emergency is not an exception. We always live in the state of emergency. We must attain to a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight. Then we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency. And this will improve our position in the struggle against not fascism, but against globalization and neo-colonialism in our context. This real state of emergency may be brought by taking the whole past. Colonialism is only a small part of that. Actually, if we continue or keep on talking about this recent history of 200 years, then it doesn't help us. Because colonialism, this British or European colonialism, is just a small part of the total history, of colonization, domination, and suppression. So, this real state of emergency may be brought by taking the whole past together and by realizing its presentness in the hope of the future. To illustrate this sense of simultaneity of past, present, and future, Benjamin takes help of the famous Paul Klee painting named Angela's Novus, that shows an Angela, and in that painting I should have brought that cartoon-like picture by Paul Klee that shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future. His back is towards the future. He is looking at the debris of the whole past. But because of that wind, he cannot go towards the past. He is forced to go towards the future against his own will. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This moment, the moment the angel, for our purposes, it's not fascism, the human, actually in the state of this, in the place of the angel, we can imagine a human being is there. So the human in the state of emergency perceives the whole past as the growing pile of debris, is the messianic moment. This is also Benjamin's phrase, messianic moment, the moment of redemption or whatever he uses, the moment of redemption, for she or he finds the hope of future in that pile. A historian who takes this as his point of departure stops telling the sequence of events like the beats of a rosary. Instead, he grasps the constellation which his own era has formed with a definite earlier one. Thus, he establishes a conception of the present as the time of the now, which is shot through with chips of messianic time. This is also from quotation from Benjamin. The way Benjamin envisions the past or history is perhaps the approach to get rid of the binaries of East-West, present, past, colonial, post-colonial, or North-South. And without getting rid of them, we cannot go beyond the paradigm set by the colonial apparatus. And we'll continue dancing with the tunes set by our masters in the name of post-colonialism. Because the first generation post-colonialists were all European scholars, committed to develop this field as a part of Neo-Orientalism. Keeping Benjamin's, now I'm coming to my main point. And before going to my main point, I have to just clarify one thing, is that I will try to use Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, as a way out. But Tagore is not accepted to anybody. The colonialists didn't like him, post-colonialists don't like him, Marxists don't like him, fundamentalists don't like him, Hindus don't like him, Muslims don't like him. So we all the time talk about Tagore, but we don't like him. We don't even care to carefully examine what are there, okay, what things there, so which we can try to develop our own ways of redemption, or we can try to create that messianic moment. Okay. So keeping Benjamin's interpretation of history as the basis or point of departure, if we respond to Tagore's understanding of self and nation in the context of colonial or post-colonial realities, we find some surprising and revealing insights which cohere with, but at the same time diverge away from the known post-colonial tradition of famine, scythe, and spaper. But to understand Tagore's concerns, one needs to be at least partially free from the prejudices cultured and promoted simultaneously by both the colonial and the subaltern agencies. Prejudices like Tagore was a modernist, as because his ideals were derivatives of English Romanticism. He was a liberal humanist who made a mixture of liberal humanism with Indian spiritualism. He was a poet who attempted to attain a kind of guruhood, etc. Once scholars, especially in Western or global northern centers, moved beyond recalling Tagore as a third world nationalist, the mystic poet of Gitanjali who won the Nobel Prize, or was briefly feted by W.B. Yeats and then renounced his knighthood in protest at Amritsar genocide. They get the space to think of Tagore as a visionary with historical imagination. This is my identification of Tagore, an individual who had the capacity with a vision of historical imagination. A visionary who remorselessly examined the traditions that shaped and conditioned him, and who, at the same time, stands outside the bounds of European modernity, both rationalist and romanticist. Okay? Tagore got involved in Swadeshi movement and then very quickly became aware of the dangers of identity based on division and hatred. He understood nationalistic movements as a counter-discourse, and counter-discourse should be understood in the context, the way Gramsci actually talked about the counter-discourse in European context. Okay? So for us, we take it as the post-colonial gaze as such. That means the colonial gaze and then the counter-discourse is the post-colonial gaze as such, as a tyrannical attempt to create goodness, and rejected the absurdity to think that you must create slaves to make your ideas free. He thought so because, in fact, I'm quoting from Tagore's nationalism, this lecture was delivered in USA by Tagore. In fact, our history has not been of the rise and fall of kingdoms, of fights for political supremacy. In our country, records of these days have been despised and forgotten, for they in no way represent the true history of our people. Our history is that of our social life. That means only 5 minutes? Sir, as the last speaker, can I take 1 or 2 minutes more? Okay. But Tagore was not blind to the influences and effects of the new floods of the world, for which wider adjustments are needed to be made. Commenting on this aspect of Tagore's concerns, Michael Collins in the book Empire, Nationalism and the Post-Colonial World Rabindranath Tagore's writings on history, politics, and society. In that book, Michael Collins observes the issue is that the post-colonial projection of one-dimensional, historically flattened modernity, Europe or West, encourages the post-colonial gaze to see imperialism writ large only as a set of rigid divisions and binaries that make the internal divisions within East and West, the various structures of thought, networks, and interactions that did in fact occur less visible. That means because of this play of the binary East-West, we fail to understand that there are other binaries, other contradictions within the East and within the West. We ignore those things because of our, the building block. We take nationalism as the basis of all our discussions. In other words, the post-colonial tendency towards provincializing Europe by essentializing Europe forecloses our appreciation of the ways in which historical actors sought to break down the division between West and East, reason and culture, modernity and tradition. Even we can connect Tagore's concerns with what Daffodil very recently has lately says that the new trend of literature which might go beyond the so-called post-colonial standard. And I'm quoting from Daffodil's writing. This was published in the magazine, the Point magazine, very recently. It was published in just last month, January. Since the beginning of the new millennium, modernism and postmodernism have run out of vitality. I now find myself fascinated by the emergence of a new kind of writing that emphasizes character in what traditional critics would surely consider to be utterly old-fashioned, realist ways. But in my view, such critics would be wrong. These new writers are not at all engaged in a nostalgic return to past literary forms. Rather, their projects arise from a deep disgust with the fakeness of so much of our culture and from an intense longing for truth, reality, and authenticity. The surprising aspect of this view is that it makes us, in a way, go 100 years back to Tagore and people like him who refuse to give up truth, reality, and authenticity for anything, and stubbornly held on the presence of the subject, of the living eye, even if it may be a constructed eye. And that's why Moi continues, it's rather that they want to convey, in spite of all this, what it feels like to exist as a particular subject in a particular time and place. This they convey is an experience that cannot be theorized away. The subject may well be construction, but there is still something it is like to be me or you in a world full of fake news, fake plots, fake facts. These writers are hanging on to their existential truth. In other words, and this is not, of course, Sartrean existentialism. We have to understand this word in with other different connotations. Okay, in other words, they insist on letting their experience matter. This phenomenology of a particular subject in a particular time and place is what Tagore stands for me. Thus, taking Benjamin's approach towards history as a totality of experience of a subject human agency in a particular time and place, and basing Tagore's understanding for reaffirmation and reinterpretation of self and samaj. That means Tagore actually rejects nationalism, the concept of, and he actually, accepts samaj, and that's why social life was very important for him. We can try to grow out of the dictates of the three most powerful bodies in the world, namely World Bank, IMF, and WTO, which have already taken initiatives to patronize the common run of postcolonialism by introducing cultural studies, identity politics, and especially postcolonial theories. One of the possible ways of doing or undoing postcolonialism or anti-postcolonialism or postcolonialism proper is to try to be acutely aware of the system that produces agencies and subsystems we are supposed to oppose, to deconstruct, to make dysfunctional. Because decolonization, if one insists on using the term, is an impossibility if we continue supporting a system that survives on colonialism. Okay. To create this awareness, we may try to replace their given vocabulary, one of the ways, their given vocabulary and terminologies such as Global South, with new terms, actually old ones, but now out of fashion, out of use. For example, we can start avoiding the word decolonize. But these binaries seem to be apparently unavoidable, and the game continues. Postmodernism was an apparent attempt to do away with that, but it ultimately proves to be an extension of old things, just with more confusion and cleverer manipulation of words. Decolonization as part of post-colonialism or resistance or whatever is part of that game. This whole business of decolonial discourse slipped into the vacuum created by superfluous flirtation of the new left with dying Marxism. In short, the superb intellectual position we are now supposed to hold is Marxism is dead, new left never existed, left capitalism is verbose stupidity, and so nothing is nothing. Like babies, we are now fascinated by new fantasies like truth/post-truth, post-realism, post-humanism, and things like that. And some of us being bored of 2 minutes? 1 minute. And some of us being bored or failing to comprehend, playing with a game of going back. So atavism and nativism and religious dogmas get revived and bring back the medieval clowns, but dangerous clowns like Trump and Modi. Yet, we can try. Sir, give me just 2 minutes. Okay. Because last paragraph, just adding the last. Okay. Yet, still we can try. One way of bypassing or outgrowing the globalized patronage system is to avoid the very language that, instead of becoming just one of the languages, has turned into a one-eyed rapacious monster. If we really want to do anything, we should start with this language. Anglo-American political-cultural nexus, in fact, BANA as such, is promoting and imposing wherever necessary and possible this Esperanto as a precondition to modern education, and with that, access to the world of capital and material comfort. The study of English language and literature and post-colonial literature as a part of that is so entangled and inseparably bound up, and that's why, when I was listening to Professor Maswood, I thought that perhaps he is delivering this term that was South Asian writing. He didn't say South Asian writing in English, but he was talking about South Asian writing in English, not South Asian writing as such, because there are hundreds of other languages, and there are other literature, other forms of literature in South Asia. Okay. So we can do this. One way of countering this crisis is taking up the questions, problems, and practices of translation in the foreground. What Professor Jaffer talked about. Translation is an act that involves two languages. By its very nature, it takes up the question of relation and interchange between languages, and thus confronts the interdependency and submerges the monolingual hegemony of one world language, and creates space for the presence and equal footing of all other languages of the post-colonial world. And by creating this space, we become aware of the diverse but interconnected worlds each language creates, and welcome the real or more comprehensive post-colonial world of the real subaltern people. Because I am quoting just the last sentence and last quotation from George Steiner's After Babel. Each language is an epiphany or articulate revelation of a specific historical cultural landscape, but that which a language reveals as being the specific genius of a community, the language itself has shaped and determined. The process is dialectical, with the formative energies of language moving both inward and outward in a civilization. Thank you.